Hi everyone, welcome back to the baking and texturing part of our Revolver tutorial. We've came quite the long way, 13 hours in Blender and a lot of steps to consider to get to the point where we are now. Every little thing that we were doing leads to the point that now enables us to make a flawless bake, and then we're gonna create textures on top of that. But before we get to the texturing part, we will make a stop at Marmoset Toolbag and import our low and high poly models to bake out the support maps that we need for the textures. In previous tutorials, I was doing that in Substance Painter, but it turns out that Marmoset is actually a much better suited baker. There are cases where it's okay to bake in Substance Painter, but for the most convenience, we want to do that in Marmoset because, for example, we are able to adjust our cage size with just a slider if we have cut off parts on the bake, things like that, as well as painting out the skewing. So if we have these floating details that we were creating in Blender, and somehow they don't look like the projection of the bake came on perfectly frontal, we are now able to simply paint over that, and that will fix it. So this is the reason why I use Marmoset from now on for everything concerned to baking. And as you may know, Marmoset also has a texturing software built into it now. That is something that we were having a look at the free Flashbang tutorial, and it's really cool, it's exciting to see. But since it's still a very young product, there are still a few things where I want to wait. Like for example, in the procedural department, Substance Painter is just bigger, has more things to pick from. And this is why I decided, okay, let's make the Revolver in Substance Painter. And I will keep checking for the updates. I'm excited to see the Marmoset texturing get better and better. I already noticed they updated it. And in the future, I don't rule out making another tutorial, even like a bigger one, entirely based on the Marmoset texturing. So that just is a side note. Other than that, let's get started. Happy baking and texturing, and cheers! Hey guys, welcome back to the baking and texturing part of our tutorial. The baking is not gonna take us very long. And the first step is to add a new bake project. And then what we wanna do is navigate to where it says Quick Loader. And then we're gonna load in our Revolver _ bake that we were just exporting from Blender. So now we have it in here, and you will see that we have all our materials here that we also assigned in Blender. By default, we only see our low poly, but the high poly is also there. If you click on that button where it says H, you will then see that we have our high poly here as well. And this is just to double check that everything exported fine. We can then simply switch back here to the low poly only, hide the high poly. So our next step is to scroll down here, and then we want to enable multiple texture sets. Now you can see our different material IDs. And then let's go to output. Let's switch that to PNG. And then as a default file name, we have to assign one. I'm just gonna put a T there, T for texture. So then it will bake with T _ Revolver, flashlight, and so on. Let's click on bake and let's see what we get. So this is rather straightforward in Marmoset, and it's really a great baking software. You will see in just a moment. So now it's done loading. Let's click on that P button here. P for preview. And on a first inspection, it looks good. So let's go to our sky, and if you want we can put the backdrop brightness down so that we have a bit of a stronger contrast. We just want to zoom in on all our areas and double check for any errors. And now we have some issues here where we have this skewing. If you look at these floating details that we were adding, they are a little bit skewed. So in order to fix that, we have full access here to all our high and low poly elements that came in here individually as we exported it from Blender. So this piece here, let's select it where we have this skewing. This is the frame. And I'm just gonna hide everything else here so that we only have the frame visible. That makes it easier to see what we're doing. So now we click here on where it says low. What you see here in green, this is the frame. So this is where we bake upon, and we can change the distance in some cases where maybe the normal map was sort of cut off if the frame wasn't reaching out far enough. But on top of that, we also have the option to fix our skewing. Let's click on that Paint Skew button. We can pretty much ignore the 2D view because we can also do it here in the 3D view. So now by painting over these parts, it will then in real time fix our skewing. Let's also do that here. And then it updates in real time. Now it's properly aligned. We don't have this offset there. So I'm just gonna go back here to where it says Bake Project. And then let's re-enable all our parts. And let's see where else we have some skewing issues. So I spotted it also here at our flashlight. Let's zoom in here at the front, and you can see that this is looking rather messed up. So same as before, we select this piece and then Paint Skew on our flashlight low. And by simply painting over it, let's zoom in a bit here. We can then fix that here in real time. So I'm also gonna paint over that part here to correct that a bit more. The painted parts will show as red, and we also see it on the right side in our 2D view. But I would find that 2D view more useful if we actually get to see our normal map. I don't know if there's a way to do that, but I haven't found it yet. So now we can close that. And let's see what else we have. So here on that piece, it looks like that was cut off a bit. Let's select that piece and let's also enable our high poly. And now we can see that this cage was sort of cutting off some parts of the high poly. So we're gonna simply increase the offset here. And then if we hide the high poly, it already did the bake, and you can see now we have more information there. And then we can also paint our skewing to compensate that a bit better. So let's select this piece here where we have the triangles, and somehow the selection doesn't work unless I click on Bake Project, and now if I click on it, it becomes active. Let's go to the low poly and let's compare with our high poly. Now that reveals that our offset is also too low. Let's grow that so that it covers everything. Let's hide the high poly, and now we have more information here. And then I also want to paint over it to make sure we don't have any skewing. It barely makes a difference. But now we also have that fixed, and let's see what else we have. Let me close these folders. So there's actually one thing that I was missing while doing the recording, and this is me speaking from the future here. There's this part on the revolver where we have the rail on top of it, where we have these 4 floating screw details, and because that was hidden by the rail, I didn't check for that. So just make sure to hide the rail and fix that there on the revolver. So whenever we're done here with fixing the skewing, we can then save our scene and prepare everything for the final bake. So let's just save it. That way we don't lose any work. If it would crash now, we would have to paint in the skewing again and things like that. So by saving that, we also save that information where we already did some fixing. So then once we have that saved, there's just one more thing that I want to fix. This here looks good, by the way. I don't see any skewing there. But at the beginning part of our barrel, where we have this detail here, and let's just go over here to that low poly for it, and then we can also paint over it. So let's just also fix that on the other side. It's a very small fix, but that way this is also corrected. And now just one more look. Let's also double check the one here at our rear side, but I'm not seeing any issues there. So that means we can do our baking now. And I'm just going to show you this screenshot. You can pause the screen to read up on it, but these are the essential support maps that we're going to bake out and then import to Substance Painter to do the best texturing job possible. So ideally we bake with our samples put to 16x or even higher if we want, but it depends on your computer. For mine, it was too much and I got that error message, and that's why I'm gonna bake in 2 different phases. So let's put our samples to 16x, and our format we're gonna have also put to 16 bits here. This is important, make sure to have that. Now let's go to configure and let's add all the maps that we want to bake. Position, thickness, curvature, object normal and normal. And now for the first round of bakes, I'm gonna enable everything aside from the thickness and the AO. I'm gonna have the revolver resolution at 4K, flashlight 2K, red dot scope lens I'm gonna put to 512, and the red dot scope at 2K. Here we have our target folder. This is already the test bake that we currently see, only the normal map. And now if we press bake, it's gonna bake everything aside from our AO and the thickness map. So now we're baking that with 16x samples. That will result in the highest possible quality. And then whenever that is done loading, we're gonna put the samples down to 4x for the AO and the thickness. You can of course try to bake with 16x for these maps too, but on my end it resulted in this crash every time. It's probably just too much for my old computer here. But like I was saying, samples put to 4x also is a good quality, and it's barely noticeable a difference. So the only noticeable difference that you will see once this is done baking is that our resolution is now higher here. Since we were baking with 4K, you see that these details here are also crystal clear. And here you see the maps that we have baked now so far. So then it's time to put that here to 4x. And we're gonna uncheck everything aside from AO and thickness. So here in our settings, make sure that you don't have ignore groups checked. The same here in our thickness settings. So leave it with the default settings, or else we would get some shadow information here once we're done baking the AO. So now I'm gonna bake with samples put to 4x to speed up the whole process and in order not to get crashes. And then we're going to import these maps into Substance Painter in just a moment. And the good thing is that, let's say you are in Substance Painter, you're already doing some texturing, and then you notice like, oh, there's a little problem, something didn't bake right. You can always go back to Marmoset, simply bake again, and Substance Painter will then sort out the rest for us. So you're not gonna have to texture everything from scratch in that case, unless you have to change the UV orientation back in Blender. But since we ruled out any errors there, that shouldn't be the case. Now we can hit that preview button again and we see our AO map here. So we can double check everything, maybe take a look here at the rail, but everything seemed to bake just fine. And that means that after double checking everything, we can then import our textures here into Substance Painter, which got bought by Adobe not too long ago, which also explains this new splash screen here, where people had mixed opinions about. But aside from that, it's still all the same. Well, actually they did reorient the UI a bit. The assets are now here on the left side, and I actually like that. I think that way we have more visibility on our materials. I'm gonna leave the document resolution at 2K and normal map format at OpenGL. And then let's import our Revolver texturing FBX, which we prepared in Blender earlier. So here we have it. I like to put the view to orthographic, same as in Blender. It's just how I prefer to work on things. If you prefer the perspective, no problem. And with Shift, we can change the lighting angle, similar to most other software. Now let's go over here to our texture tab and let's hit that plus icon. We're gonna go to add resources, and then I'm going to navigate here to that folder where we have all our baked textures. I'm gonna select all of them. Now what we have to do, and I wish there was a button for it where we can just do it for all, but since I didn't find that, we have to put it all here to texture. So this is the only manual work that we have to do, since we didn't bake in Substance Painter itself, where that would then automatically get assigned. But since we did the baking in Marmoset, we have to manually tell it, look, these maps are textures. And then, very important, I'm just gonna freeze the frame here for a moment, because I'm about to actually make a mistake where I put it to current session instead of putting it to project untitled. So make sure to put the second option, or else when you reload your scene after you saved it, you would have to import the textures again. In the past, it would work with current session, so that's why I made that mistake. Make sure to put it to project untitled. So then, whenever this is done importing, we have to drag it to the proper slots where it belongs. I'm gonna put the view here to this list view. That way it's easier to see and to select. And now let's start here with our flashlight, which is already selected. And then let's scroll down here. And here at the bottom, we have our mesh maps. So what we're gonna do is drag and drop. Let's start from the top here. Curvature, AO, flashlight normal. Just make sure to put it in the right slots. And if not, you can simply hit that X icon there to clear it and redo it. So now you can see we have this reflecting here on our flashlight. Let's go to our scope and let's continue. So once again, this is the manual work that we have to do here. But still, it's worth it to bake in Marmoset compared to Substance Painter baking, which has its limits. Things like that scoop painting, for example, we can't do here. Now, the red dot scope dot is a simple alpha texture. We don't have anything to import there. So let's carry on with our lens. So it might be a little bit overkill to have all these maps here for this glass material, but since we have it, let's make use of it as well. So here we have the position map, and then the last one is the thickness. And we can continue with our revolver. I'm just going to zoom out a bit so that we see our changes reflecting here. Let's put the AO and then our curvature map, which is important for all our generators to work properly. But all these maps are working hand in hand with each other. They all do a little bit of magic sauce ingredients, which then we can use for our effects, generators, masking, and so on. So now let's make also sure to save our scene here. So for the next few minutes, I'm gonna slowly go over a few fundamental things for Substance Painter as well as our maps that we baked, just so that people that are completely new to Substance Painter or texturing are also on the same page as someone who's already familiar with it. So now we baked, imported, and successfully assigned these support maps here. Remember that screenshot I showed you before we did the baking? That explains all these different maps. But simply put, every one of these maps has its own importance when it comes to how our masks and generators and other things are working here in Painter. And in order to showcase that a bit better before we get started, let's just go over here to our layer tab. And now I'm gonna add a fill layer. I'm gonna make that a bit dark. And then once we add a black mask to it, it will disappear because the default layer will always show as white, even if there's nothing on it. So if we add that back on here with our black mask, we can, by the way, toggle that mask by pressing Shift. And then we right click and we add a generator to it. For example, let's have the dirt. Then we can see how these generators work hand in hand here with our image inputs. Those textures here, in that case the revolver textures, and here in that case it's making use of 4 of these textures. So for example, the position map here, so that it knows that the dirt is supposed to form up here in certain directions and not just randomly all over the place. And also very importantly, our curvature map here and the AO map that can also help us to have these generators working in areas where it just makes sense. And we can then, of course, further tune that here. So this is essentially what we're gonna do as we work on our texture. And this is just so to explain to you, or those that are new to texturing, why we had to actually bake all these additional maps here. They will just help us to get the best result. And then whenever we're finished with our texture, we can go over here to export textures, and then individually here for our different elements we can define things such as the size, and also we have our output template here where we can put it already to a target engine. So let's say you want to export that to Unreal. We can then select this and it will automatically export it in a way where it's the best format that the target engine is supposed to read. But for now, we don't have to be bothered with any of that, and we can just focus on making the best texture possible. So of course the question is, where do we start with our texture? And in order to answer that, I'm gonna bring up some reference images here. And we can see that there is still some detail work which clearly has some height information. You can see that those things here are actually engraved into the metal, and we need to replicate that in order to get the most realistic look. Of course, we also have some things here that we were earlier deleting actually in Blender after we already added it. We did those screws here, and those things we can just add better here in Substance Painter over just baking it in. That way we are flexible with our placement and with our size. So in that case, I was saying like, okay, let's delete it and let's do that in Substance Painter. Same here for that one. We also deleted that. If you take a look at it here, we don't have this, so we have to add that back. So in short, we have some things that we can do with procedural textures that are already in Substance Painter. So we're going to make use of that. But then it's a bit of a mix where we also have some details here, such as these logos. And of course, those we can create procedurally. So we're going to bring them in as alpha textures. And those come with the tutorial. In the essential folder, you will find those textures. We just have to import them. Those are really simple black and white images technically. So that's what an alpha texture is. It's black and white information, or it could also have shades of gray. But for this purpose, it's just going to be black and white. And I created those textures here in Photoshop, if you wonder how. So if you ever need to create an alpha texture, bring up Photoshop, have a blank canvas, and then basically all you need is black and white information here. In that case, like this is this small detail that we were just looking at. And I base it here on like a reference image that I also brought in, just to have like the proper idea, like how far is this here apart. It might be a very small detail, but as we know, the small details matter and they sum up. So this is why I went through the troubles of like making an alpha texture for something even as small as this here. And that way we can make sure that we really have the most realistic look that we can have once we're done with our texture. So let's go back here to Substance Painter and let's import those textures. So for that, let's go back here to Import Resource and let's navigate to this folder where we have them. I'm gonna select everything and then we're gonna define it as alpha this time. So let's just make sure everything here is set to it. And then let's bring it into the current session. So now we have all these alpha textures, and now we can essentially start by adding all the details on our gun that are currently still missing. And we're gonna do the same for our flashlight and also for our scope. So once we have that, we can then just focus on making the actual texture. But for now, we're gonna be busy adding those little elements to it to have the complete look. So let's get started with those screws. And for that, first of all, let's get rid of this layer that we created earlier. And let's create a new group. And I'm gonna call it Normal Details and Text. So in here, I wanna create a standard layer. For most of the time, we're gonna make use of fill layers, but in that case, we want to use existing normal map information, and we can find that by searching here for screw. So these here are essentially also just textures, but in that case, they consist out of normal map information. So what we want to do is go over here to our brush settings. And right now we're painting with all these properties here: color, metal, roughness, and so on. What I want to do is disable everything aside from normal. And now you can see here that we can drag something in here, and in that case we want to have the slotted round screw here. So for those of you that are new to Substance Painter, or just as a reminder, if we press Control and right mouse button, and then we move the mouse left or right, we can change the size of our brush. So this is very important. If you're not used to it, better get used to it, because this is really mandatory action here for Substance Painter. If you push the mouse up, you can change the hardness. In that case, we want to have maximum hardness. If you push it down, you can make it more soft. So in that case, we want to have maximum hardness. And now let's navigate to some areas where we want to have this screw element. And let's just bring that down here to something like this. And if you remember, we have one of these screws here. So I also have some reference images on my secondary monitor. And now let's just stamp that in here. By the way, if you press Control and the left mouse button, you can also change the direction here. So that way we can get some variation in there. But here is basically our first normal map stamp. And now let's go over here to that exploded part so that we have full visibility here on this element here, this rear side element, because we also have some screws to stamp in here. So speaking of reference images, I have them on the right side, and for example here we have two of these screws missing. And let's go ahead and just make sure it's nicely centered. Maybe I make it a little bit bigger here. And then let's stamp that also in here. So same over here, but that one is a little bit smaller from the looks of it. So I'm gonna have it around here. And also let me just turn that around again. So we have some variety there. Now let's lock here into this view, and we also have some of them here, two to be exact. Let's take a look here at the reference image, because we sort of have to eyeball it where we want to place this. When we look at that here, we can see that this is pretty much in the center here of this element, and this one seems to be a bit bigger than this one. So let's take that into account, and I'm gonna basically just have it here in the center. By the way, you can see my brush size. If I scroll up here, I have that at 1.85. And then let's have another one. This one is a bit smaller. Gonna have it here at 1.2. And let's stamp that here. Actually, let me undo that and let me rotate that around a bit. So this one is sort of here very close to the grip. Just make sure to not accidentally stamp on the grip. By the way, speaking of which, we can also do that by pressing F3 and jump straight here into our 2D view. So technically we could also do the stamping work here. Pressing F1 will toggle out of it. Now we have a split view, and F2 will get us back here to the viewport. By the way, right now we are in a 2K texture resolution here for our viewport. However, if we go over here to our texture settings and we put that to 4K, you can see that this is actually now looking much higher res as the one that we are stamping it on while we are in 2K. So this is just something to remind you that even though we are working in 2K for performance reasons, when we switch to 4K, this is actually our final resolution, or let's just say the maximum resolution. Later we can still decide what format we want to have or which resolution, but it just makes sense to work in 2K in order to get the best performance. So if you remember from our unwrapping, we were sharing the texture space for the grip. And that makes it a bit of a special case. Let's just make that a bit bigger here, maybe 2.5. If we stamp that in, we get that butterfly effect here, especially if we have this here with this rotation. So what we want to do is rotate this so that it's perfectly straight. One moment, here we go. And now if we stamp it, we have the problem that we don't really see the center. However, we can go over here to our display settings, and if you scroll down, you can enable the mesh wireframe, and that way we are able to perfectly center this here. Or we could press F3 and we go in our 2D view and find that piece, which we have over here. So we don't really need that wireframe. I'm just gonna disable it, but sometimes it's useful, for example, a case like that here. So let's go back here to the last remaining piece, which is this one. So here we have it. So I'm gonna rotate it, scale it a bit down, and then let's fit it in there so that on the left side it has around the same padding there to the sides. So now we have pretty much put all the screws here in place. There are still a few extra details that we need to take care of, and most of it is gonna be procedural and the alpha textures that we were importing. But let's just have a few more here with our normal map stamps. And in particular, if you zoom in here, you can see that this detail is a little bit soft. So if you look here at the reference image, we want to have a bit more sharpness there. So what I'm going to do is scroll down here on our brush. And in that case, I'm going to make use here of this one, the hexagon round. So now we have this one as an active brush. And I'm gonna go over here to our layers. Let's just call that layer here screws, and then let's have a new layer for the extra stuff. I'm just gonna call that extra details, and then let's just give this here a stamp as well, and we want to make that on both sides. So now this is a bit more interesting looking. And there is something else which I discovered very late, and that is actually that we also have some information here. So here on the reference image we can see that we have 3 of these details there. And I'm just gonna remain here with this brush, and in order to do that the best way, to make sure we really have the center, I'm gonna go over here to our UV, or I should say 2D view, and let's press F1 so that we have this split screen. So first of all, let's actually find where that is. So I'm just gonna have a stamp here, and here we can see it. So I'm just gonna make sure it's centered, and then let's have another one here on that side, and then there's another one here, And it's kind of interesting, when we stamp here in the viewport on that one, look, it also appears here. So it basically stamps through both of these elements. So I'm gonna undo that, and I'm gonna go over here to our alignment and put that to UV. So now if I stamp on here, you can see it's not appearing. I mean, not that it would really be a problem if it appears here, but this is just something to be aware of. So in that case, I already looked and I know that this is here, that piece. And I'm just gonna stamp that here also in the center. So here's a good use case why sometimes it makes sense to go into that UV view. And now we have these details, and I'm gonna go back here to full screen. So if we look at our reference images, there is quite the complex area where the hammer is actually falling down. And because we barely ever see that, but we still want to have a bit of information there, we can also make use of this normal map brush that we currently have selected. So let's go over here to our exploded view, and basically let's just stamp that in there in the center. So let's have it somewhere around there, a bit more there on the top. So even though it's a very small detail, it might still be cool to have that. So let me just have another look around here. And since I have this reference image open, we also have some details on here, even though we actually don't get to see them. However, I think it would be cool to have a small detail there. So what I want to do is zoom in, make that quite small, and maybe we have it here. So that way that trigger looks a little bit more interesting, and because it's sharing the texture space here with the other side, we also have it here on that side. So just a small extra detail. And with this extra detail layer that we have here, there is just one more that, and before we get to stamping our alpha textures, there is one more that I thought would be cool having, which is that if we look here into our exploded view, or that version here where we have the cylinder sort of leaning out, it would be nice to have something here in the background where it sort of transitions into this object. That's something that we don't actually have on the reference, but I just thought it would be cool to have. So I'm gonna search here for normal, and then we want to use this circle bump. We can remain here in the UV view, and then we just want to switch that over here to circle bump, press F1 to get into the split screen view, and then we have to find that side here of the cylinder. In that case is this one. So in order to center that in the best way possible, let's have a look here at these circles that we have, and then I'm just gonna bring that up here. And basically we want that this outer radius is touching the sides of these smaller cylinders. So around here. And now we can scale that down a bit, and let's just stamp it down. And there we have it. So that way we made sure that this is perfectly centered here, and just provides us with a bit more extra depth here to make that look more interesting. So now we can actually get out of the UV view back into the tangent wrap, and that way once we're back here into our viewport by pressing F2, we can just continue working here. So right now we are pretty much done adding the normal map information here, at least on our revolver. So if we cycle here by pressing C, we can actually get to the channel that shows us everything that we were just stamping on here. If we continue pressing C, we get to the view where it shows us everything with our combined normal map, which at the moment is simply the one that we were importing from Marmoset. As we are working on that texture, we're gonna also add height information, and that height information will also be visible here in our normal view. As you can see here, it says normal plus height. So this, just to not confuse you with the height channel, it essentially all gets merged into our normal channel here once we're done with our texture and we're ready to export. If you press M, you get back to the default view here. And now let's start by adding some of these alpha textures here to our revolver, and then we also have to do that to our scope and the flashlight. So this layer, I'm gonna call it alpha textures, and let's add a black mask to it, and then let's filter this here to revolver. So this shows us all the textures that we were importing that we have to stamp onto the revolver. So let's get started with those logos here, which are these two here. Or if you want, you can also have an alternative version here with a chamfer zone logo. But if you want it to be based on the reference, we're gonna take this one here. Just click on it, and our brush here already has this information then. And then let's zoom in here on this piece. I'm gonna make sure to have that reference image here on the left side, actually on the right side. And then what we also want to do is go back here into that material, and we want to disable everything aside from the height information. So at the moment we have our height set to 0, which means we wouldn't actually see anything if we would stamp that on our mask. So let's already put the slider here to some smaller amount. We push that here to the left, and then if we go back to our mask, we can now stamp our logo on here. I'm gonna make that a bit bigger, and I have my reference on the right side. So now we have our logo here, and the beauty is that we can always go back here to that fill layer and we can further adjust our height information. But in general, we want that to be rather subtle for the engraved parts. So I'm gonna have like a small amount here. We can always fine tune that later. And by the way, we can also put our layers back on if we would ever need it. So if we have color, for example, right now we don't see it because it's white on white. But if we would change that, that way we get color information in here. So all these channels, we can still work with them even if we have them disabled. So we don't need that here. I'm gonna disable it. And I just want to show you again, if we press C, now we have this information here also in our normal channel. Okay, actually I'm gonna call this layer here logos. So let's also add the smaller one here that belongs on the grip. So I'm gonna also have a look here at our reference image, scale that down. And you know what? Before I stamp that on, I want to go here to that layer, which by the way, we can also delete, but I'm gonna add a fill layer on top. Let's delete this layer that we don't need, and then let's just have this fill layer here, and let's put it to a darker tone. So that way we see a bit better what we're doing here. And then back to this logo. Gonna make it a bit smaller. Let me show you the brush size that I have. I think that looks about right. And then let's stamp that here sort of into the center. There we have it. And you know what? I'm actually gonna undo that. I changed my mind. I make this here the big logo, and then I'm gonna just duplicate that layer, right click it, duplicate. I'm gonna call that small logo. You can see how now we have double the information. So what we have to do is right click on that mask and say add black mask. That way it gets overwritten. And now we can have this here as an individual layer. So that way we have more control over each logo individually if we want to change the height information. And in this case, I actually think that we could give this a bit of an extra bump here to have that a bit stronger looking. And now let's press Ctrl and D to make a duplicate on that. And I'm gonna call that layer arrow. But let's not forget to right click the black mask and overwrite it. So now we have this here as a new layer. And then we want to have this arrow here. I'll make it a bit smaller and stamp it here. So now we have this. Let's get over to our other side here. And let's have this logo here. I'm gonna once again duplicate one of these layers. I'm gonna call this MP. Make a new black mask for it. Scale that up here. It's actually not that big, so I'm gonna have it around here. Maybe a bit bigger. And then just gotta eyeball it here with a reference. Okay, looks about right there. Next, I'm gonna duplicate that layer. And then let's call this one 8. So as always, let's look at our reference image. Also, let's once again overwrite our mask so that we have this here as a blank new mask. And then let's stamp that in here. If you wonder why I have that in here twice and you don't, I had to bring that texture in again and somehow it shows up twice and I don't see a way to delete this here. It's a bit strange. Either way, now let's duplicate that layer. And I'm gonna call that Made in USA. And also I wanna add a black mask to it. Now let's select this here. So before we stamp, let's just make sure we really have around the same space as seen here on the reference. And then again, let's just stamp. But there is also another way that we can add this kind of height information here, especially when it comes to text. In the case of this text that we were just stamping on, it just made more sense to prepare it in Photoshop because it's a bit specific there with the alignment and all that. But for something more easy, for example, this here, we can also make use of the text tool that is already in Substance Painter. So once again, I'm gonna duplicate that layer here, Ctrl D. And I'm just gonna call that Cal. Let's right click and add a black mask. And then if we come over here to our search bar and we enter font into it, we get to see our different options that we have here for procedural fonts, which enable us to just type any message into it and then stamp it on. So what we have to do is decide which one we want to take. And I like this one here, but I think this one here also looks pretty cool. So I'm actually going to take that one. So let's simply select it. And you can see now here it changed to already having this default text on here. And then in order to change the default text, let's scroll down here and simply enter it here into this field. And right now you can see that it's cut off by our mask. What we have to do is put the size down. You can put it up a bit, and then we can change our size and stamp down, same as before. So we also have some text here. And for that, once again, I'm gonna make a new layer, or I should say duplicate, add the black mask back, and I'm just gonna call it extra text. And in that case, I'm seeing it says XMP 0834. We can also have it like that here. And that way we already have it nicely centered there. Actually, if I see that correctly, it looks like that. It's not centered. So let's just have it like that too. Here we have to put it down a bit more, the size, which doesn't really matter as long as our brush gets scaled up again. And then, oh, you know what? Actually, it doesn't belong here, it belongs there. So I was actually looking at the wrong side of it. This here is where we want to place the stamp. So just find the right position and then let's stamp it here like that. So if we look at our reference, we can actually also enable color and leave it with a default white, as seen here. One thing that's important to point out is that even though I'm always trying to stick as close to the original reference as possible, we also have some artistic liberty here. So if something actually looks cool in your opinion or better than on the reference, then make it so. And for now, we're gonna carry on by making that grip pattern with our procedural textures. So this here is what we want to achieve. And before we add these little bumps, what we're gonna do is we're gonna make this pattern here. And the best way to approach this is to go into our split screen view. So let's press F1 and then let's put both the grip here in the 3D viewport as well as here in the 2D into our focus. And in that case here we have to rotate it around. If you press Alt, you can rotate, and that way we can have the best position here on that, same as here. So now in order to best see what we're actually painting there, let's create a folder, and then into that folder, which we can give a proper name here, let's call it grip pattern, we want to add a fill layer. So this fill layer, let's put it to red, just so that we really see a strong signal color here. And let's add a black mask back on it. Now we're still in our text mode here on our brush. So let's go where we have the alpha information and let's remove this. So now in order to get our standard brush back, we have to search for shape and select this shape here. So now once again we can harden our brush by pressing Ctrl and moving the mouse up with the right mouse button pressed, and then we can start painting here. But let me undo that and let's get a better lighting angle on here while pressing Shift. So ideally we want to have this normal information here visible where we have these grooves. And next, let's put the spacing of our brush down to 1. If we have this further up like this, you will see it's doing that when we paint. So ideally, we want to have this at the absolute minimum here for this task, because we want to have a continuous flow. So let me also put the alignment here to UV, because we're working here in the 2D view. And I'm just gonna scroll up here so that you can see my brush size. So if we look at our reference image, we can see that we have a pretty straight edge here, and then we have this curve here. So we could just use a sphere here, basically just stamp on a round pattern and then take it from there. And then we also have very spherical things where basically the pattern just cuts off here. So these are the things that we need to look at here on our reference image. So let's see what we can do here. It might look simple, but is a little bit tricky. So we have this fairly big sized brush, and let's just stamp that down here for starters. And now let's scale that down. And if we click on it again, and then we press Shift, we make a continuous stroke down here. So now you can see it's still a little bit zigzaggy, and that's always the case, but we can try to minimize that by making a smaller brush and then lead it up again. So now with that in place, let's click down here, and then we want to carry that over here to the left side. So once again, I'm pressing Shift to have this continuous stroke, and now we can see that the alignment here doesn't really fit our reference image. You can see this is more aligned there to this edge that we have there, so we have to compensate for that. So let's just hand paint that. In that case, I don't actually do the continuous stroke, but it's always a bit of a mixture. So now we can just have a continuous stroke up here, and then also over here to the right side, so that we have this straight edge that we saw on the reference image. So I'm gonna have a bit more fine tuning here at the bottom, and also one more stroke up here, which we can do with Shift. So now we have this basic shape here, and we want to increase the brush size. And if we press X, we can make it a black mask, which means that we take away from the information. So let's just take another look here at the reference. If we zoom in here, we can see that it has a bit of a round transition there at the center. So we have to account for that as well. Let's carry on here first by making these stamps. And now what we can do is put our brush back to being white, so we add to it, and then with a very small brush we are adding these tips to it here. That's why it's important to be in the 2D view, because on the 3D view that might not be as visible for us as having it all laid out here perfectly flat. So now we want to also go back here to our black brush, and let's just trim that a bit here. And here with just individual clicks, we can make that a bit more round there. And I also want to put the resolution back to 2K because I notice it's getting a little bit slow now. Maybe on your end that's not the case, but my computer is already 5 years old now. And it's time to upgrade soon, I think. So this looks pretty good. Let's just once more take a look at the reference. And I'm thinking that right now it's extending out a bit too much here. So I want to also trim that a bit here at the back. So now we have this shape here, and I'm just going to do a bit more trimming here, also here at this corner. But mostly we're done here. Maybe a bit more here at the top where it's a bit pointy. So now this all looks nice, and we can then proceed to add procedural textures for this grip pattern. We have these dots there, and this is the perfect use case for some of the amazing procedural textures that come with Substance Painter.